What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today. The regular season has officially concluded, and it did so with a bang in this year's edition of Rivalry Week. We had upsets all over the place, great games everywhere. All the conference championship game races have been decided. There were massive brawls after basically every game, it felt like. We had one of the longest games in college football history. We'll get into that. And the 2024 season delivered yet again with another historic week. Let's get right into one of the biggest upsets of the entire year. 6-5 Michigan went on the road to number 2 Ohio State, and the Wolverines were without their top defender, one of their best defensive backs in the country in Will Johnson. Missing their starting tight end, Colston Loveland. They were 21-point underdogs, but none of that mattered. For a fourth consecutive season, Michigan defeated Ohio State, doing so this time by a low-scoring total of 13-10. This is the first time that the Wolverines have beaten the Buckeyes in 4 consecutive years since 1988 to 1991, and this was the lowest scoring game between the two since 2007. This game was pretty much exactly what the final score depicts. Sometimes final scores can be deceiving, but this one is spot on. Horrifyingly bad offense, phenomenal defense, multiple turnovers for each, 2 missed field goals for Ohio State, a very slow, sloppy game, and Michigan made one more play in the end. Wolverines running back Kalel Mullings was really the only outstanding offensive player in the game. He had 32 carries for 116 yards and a touchdown, including a critical 27-yard run on third down late in the game to get Michigan into field goal range. Then on defense, Ernest Hausman, Mason Graham, and Amir Hall were all solid for Michigan, and then guys like Sawyer, Downs, and Ransom were all great for Ohio State. But yeah, a very slow-moving, defensive-dominated game, and the only 3 points scored in the entire second half were Michigan's game-winning field goal with under a minute left. As much as I have trouble quantifying it, this game just didn't look like a fluke. You know how certain games can kind of just feel like an upset, and there's just crazy plays that go, one team's way over and over and over. This game wasn't like that, and of course Ohio State has higher-rated players all over the place, and they've played better all year, and they beat a top 10 team by 23 points last week, and that same Indiana team beat Michigan. But Saturday in Columbus, these two teams looked almost identical in a lot of areas. Davis Warren certainly didn't have his best game at quarterback for Michigan. He was 9 of 16 for 62 yards and 2 interceptions. He did actually start, I think, 5 of 5, but yeah, finished 9 of 16. So Will Howard had his worst game of the year. He was 19 of 33 for 175, a touchdown and 2 picks. And if you didn't do the quick math, their completion percentages were 56% and 57% respectively. So pretty similar just in terms of accuracy, and then both had 2 interceptions. Then those turnovers were in almost the exact same spots on the field. I think 3 of the 4 interceptions were thrown in the same red zone, the one on the left side of the screen if you're watching on TV, but both teams had trouble in that specific area of the field and kept turning it over there. In total yardage, it was 252 to 235 Ohio State, just 17 yards apart. First downs were 16-13 Ohio State. Turnovers were even. Time of possession was in Michigan's favor, and overall they just played an extremely even game. While they were even in the game as a whole, the fourth quarter was extremely lopsided and was simply unbelievable in terms of what Michigan did to Ohio State. These stats are strictly from the fourth quarter of that game. They're courtesy of Trevor McHugh on Twitter. In the fourth quarter, Michigan had 101 total yards. Ohio State had 10. 10 total yards in the entire fourth quarter. They had 9 rushing yards and 1 singular passing yard in the entirety of the fourth quarter. Michigan ran 22 plays. Ohio State ran 7. Michigan had the ball for 13 minutes and 3 seconds of the fourth quarter. Ohio State had it for 1 minute, 57 seconds. So 13 minutes to 2 minutes if you just round those numbers. 13 to 2 in time of possession in the fourth quarter. Then first downs were 8-0 in favor of Michigan. And if you go back to what I said a minute ago about first downs, Ohio State won that 16-13 overall. So it was 16-5 in first downs going into the fourth quarter before Michigan just started dominating everything. Yards per play, 4.6 to 1.4 in the fourth quarter in favor of Michigan. 1.4 yards per play for the Buckeyes in the entire fourth quarter. And I think you get the picture. When the game was on the line and time was running out, Michigan came alive and Ohio State fell completely flat. Coming in as a 20-point favorite, this was Ohio State's largest upset loss at home since 1998. Ohio State falls to 10-2, Michigan improves to 7-5, and then of course afterward there was the brawl between the two extremely passionate teams. The Wolverines tried to plant a flag at midfield. Ohio State didn't necessarily love that idea. And then for some reason, a couple of players even got pepper sprayed when they were trying to separate the fight, which was pretty abnormal, but the post-game fights were a common thread throughout the entire day. Winning this game felt like such a given, something that they absolutely had to have, and something that it felt like they were going to get coming into the week for Ryan Day and the Ohio State Buckeyes. I mean, this is Michigan's worst team since 2020, and that's, of course, a major asterisk, so this is really their worst team since 2014. And if Day and Ohio State couldn't get it done with the disparity this season, when the Buckeyes are 10-1, they need to win one game to go to the Big Ten championship. They're ranked number 2, and only because they lost to number 1. And Michigan's there at 6-5. And then not only the disparity between the two teams as a whole, but also who Michigan was missing. They were missing Will Johnson, one of the best defensive backs in the country. Not just Michigan's defensive backs, one of the best that there is in the sport right now. And then Colston Loveland's up there with some of the best tight ends as well. So not only was Michigan 6-5, they were missing some of the players that helped them even get to 6 wins in the first place, and Ohio State still couldn't beat them. So it's kind of an easy and popular talking point, but if Ohio State couldn't beat this team with the roster that they have, the $20 million, the best that NIL can buy roster that they assembled, it's hard to imagine when that next win over Michigan might come. Their loss knocked them out of the Big Ten championship race and allowed Penn State, after they beat Maryland, the opportunity to get in and face the number 1 Oregon Ducks. On Friday night, before we even got to the chaos that was Saturday, Friday was insane in its own right. Georgia Tech went on the road to Georgia and played the second longest game in college football history. The Dogs outlasted the Yellow Jackets 44-42 in 8 overtimes to earn the win. And Georgia Tech dominated this matchup for about the first 51 minutes of the game, and then things took a turn in favor of Georgia. I was pretty outspoken about this on Twitter and Instagram on Friday night, but this did not feel like an evenly officiated game in the slightest, and that became clear when Georgia needed it most. And not to take anything away from the Dogs' win, they made the plays in overtime and made one more than Georgia Tech, but in my opinion, this game shouldn't have gone to overtime in the first place. It's been a theme with SEC officiating all throughout the year. It's been truly awful at points, but that was on full display on Friday night in Athens. The Yellow Jackets led 20-6. It was 4th down for Georgia. They're in the red zone. Beck throws a pass to the end zone, falls incomplete. Turnover on downs, and then a flag flies in. The call was pass interference on Georgia Tech. The Dogs get a second life, and they score a couple plays later. Not only was the PI extremely questionable to begin with, but they also mentioned on the broadcast that it appeared that a Georgia Tech defender got a finger on the ball and tipped it at the line, which would make pass interference irrelevant. Pass interference can occur if the ball is tipped at the line, which it appeared to be, and that they mentioned on the broadcast that it looked like it had been. So that was a big one. Georgia goes from turning it over, staying down 14 with 8 minutes left, to getting a second chance and making it a 20-13 game. Then there was the extremely pivotal play where Haynes King was hit and fumbled with 2 minutes left. Haynes King fumbled after he took one of the most blatant shots to the head that I've seen all season, and the Georgia defender put the top of his helmet directly into King's face mask and neck and chest area and jarring the ball loose in the process. And not only was the brutal hit not called targeting on the field, it wasn't even reviewed. It wasn't even looked at for the potential of targeting. Had it been called targeting, that would have been Georgia Tech's ball, 2 minutes left at midfield. Worst case scenario for them, they run some clock, make Georgia use their 3 timeouts, and pin the Dogs on the other side of the field. Best case scenario for them is that they get 2 first downs and win the game. Instead, Georgia was given the ball at the 31-yard line. Then immediately after that, the officials missed one of the most blatant holds you'll ever see. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see it there. Just not even close to legal, but no flag. Georgia scored 2 plays after that. And like I said at the beginning, Georgia Tech had other opportunities to win and missed them. Both teams missed field goals in regulation, for example, but the main point being is that this game never should have gone to overtime. And I actually thought the officiating was pretty good for about 50 minutes. And then all of a sudden, when Georgia was in severe trouble, every single call and lack thereof went one way. The quarterback play was phenomenal on both sides. We'll save Haynes King for the end of the episode because he is a king of the week. But Carson Beck was great as well. He had 297 passing yards and 5 touchdowns. And overall, both QBs provided an extremely entertaining game. The result lets Georgia improve to 10-2. It preserved their now 31-game home winning streak. And you might have heard Joe Tessitore say it on the broadcast, but it also most likely locks them into a college football playoff spot, regardless of the SEC title game outcome. Georgia Tech falls to 7-5, but this isn't anywhere close to a 7-5 team. And I think most of the country saw that on Friday night in Athens, but they were without Haynes King for 2 of those losses and took Georgia to 8 overtimes, of course. They beat 9-3 Duke by 10. They beat number 6 Miami. One of their other losses was to Kyle McCord and 9-3 Syracuse, who we'll get to in just a second. And their record is 7-5, but they are far better than that. Brent Key's done a phenomenal job at Atlanta over the past couple of years. Their recruiting starting to pick up a little bit as well, and it'll be interesting to see what things look like at Georgia Tech next season. On Saturday afternoon in Syracuse, New York, Fran Brown, Kyle McCord, and the Orange took down number 6 Miami in thrilling fashion. Syracuse beat Miami 42-38, but this game was out of hand for the Orange for much of the first half. Miami jumped out to a 21-0 lead, 21-0, and this really wasn't something we'd seen a lot throughout the season from Miami, at least against conference and Power 4 opponents. In their other games, Miami was almost always the more dominant team in the second half, but rarely ever in the first. So with a 21-0 lead, it felt like this game was going to be all Canes right from the jump. If they had a 21-point lead in the first half, it seemed like with the way that all of their other games had gone, that was only going to grow as the game went on. Then slowly but surely, Kyle McCord and that offense started chipping away. They connected on a few big plays. Trevor Pena and Jackson Meeks were phenomenal in the receiving room. LaQuinn Allen had several good runs, and they erased that deficit. The turning point in this game was right at the end of the third quarter, where both teams exchanged fumbles, but one ended up being much more critical than the other. Syracuse drove all the way down to the Miami 17 before running back Yasin Willis fumbled and Miami recovered it. Then 4 plays later on Miami's drive, Syracuse DB Devin Grant made one of the best individual plays of the week and one of the more impactful individual plays of the entire season. Grant punched the ball out of Xavier Restrepo's hands, recovered it, and then took it 56 yards the other way for a touchdown. He got a tackle, forced fumble, fumble recovery, and scoop and score touchdown all on the same play at a very important spot in the game to give Syracuse the lead. The Orange went on to win 42-38, and in his first season as head coach there, Fran Brown has led Syracuse to a 9-3 record, their best since 2018. Syracuse beat a healthy Georgia Tech team, they beat a ranked UNLV team on the road, and they now have a top 10 win over Miami. Kyle McCord finishes the regular season as the nation's leader in passing yards, and Syracuse overall has just had an extremely impressive year. Miami falls to 10-2, they're eliminated from the ACC championship race, and we'll see where they end up in terms of getting an at-large bid to the college football playoff. In my opinion, they're still a CFP team. They have the best quarterback in the country in Cam Ward. They have the best offense in the country in points per game scored. They're 10-2. They lost close on the road twice to Georgia Tech, who we all saw what they're capable of on Friday, and to 9-3 Syracuse, who has the leader in passing yards in Kyle McCord. They don't have any losses like Alabama's to Oklahoma, and I think they should be right around that number 10 or number 11 seed. With Miami suffering a second loss in conference play, that means Clemson finishes second in ACC standings, and they'll get that spot in the championship game against SMU, which is very important for the Tigers because they themselves fell out of at-large bid contention on Saturday afternoon. Number 15 South Carolina defeated number 12 Clemson 17-14 on the road in Death Valley, and the Gamecocks earned one of the biggest wins that their program has had in over a decade. Clemson was in control of this game for just about all of it until Lenora Sellers put the Gamecocks in front with a minute to go. He was a beast throughout the entire game, especially late in the fourth quarter on his 20-yard touchdown run to take the lead. We'll save the rest of his stats for the end of the episode. He's a king of the week, so stick around to the end for that because he was remarkable. After South Carolina took a 3-point lead, Clemson drove all the way down the field into field goal range very quickly. But on a strange checkdown pass, the ball tipped off of Phil Maffa's hands and was intercepted by South Carolina linebacker Demetrius Knight, which sealed it for the Gamecocks. This game was pretty similar to that of Michigan and Ohio State in a couple ways. 2 red zone interceptions, very slow moving. Clemson had an odd play where Klubnik's leg hit that of his own offensive lineman, causing him to trip, where he pitched the ball to Phil Maffa, who had it for a second and then also fell down and dropped it. They reviewed it and called it a fumble, which South Carolina recovered. That was at the South Carolina 32 when Clemson was up 7 and driving. With the win, South Carolina improves to 9-3 on the year and stays on the bubble of college football playoff at-large bid contention with teams like Miami and BYU and Alabama and Ole Miss. For Clemson, they fall to 9-3, but with Miami's loss, they are in the ACC championship game where they can win their way into the college football playoff. It's fitting that Clemson's mascot is a type of cat because they just seem to have 9 lives and will not die for this 2024 season. There's just been time after time after time this year where it looks like, okay, now they're finally eliminated from playoff contention, and they just seem to find a way to still be in it. They lost to Georgia in week 1. They only scored 3 points. It looked like, okay, this is just a continuation of the 9-4 Clemson team from last year. Definitely not a playoff contender, but then they kind of fixed some things on offense. They rattled off, I think, 5 or 6 in a row, and then they lost to Louisville by 12 at home, and that was like, okay, this team has 2 losses. They just got beaten by double digits at home. It was the first time they'd lost a home night game in like a decade, and it's like, okay, they're out of the ACC race probably, and definitely out of the playoff race now. Then they win a couple more games. A lot of the teams in front of them lose. It's like, okay, suddenly Clemson's back in at-large contention. They're out of the ACC race with SMU and Miami being as dominant as they are, but maybe they could get in as an at-large bid. Then they lose to South Carolina at home. It's like, okay, now they're officially eliminated from everything. Miami just has to go beat Syracuse. They have no shot at that, and then obviously their at-large bid is completely out. Then Miami loses to Syracuse, and Clemson's back in the ACC championship conversation, in the ACC championship game, and now they are 1 win from the college football playoff. To put it in a statistical context for the 9 lives analogy, Clemson lost on Saturday and now has a higher % chance to make the playoff than they did coming into last week. They lost their game on Saturday and have a higher % chance to make the playoff than they did last Friday, which is absolutely ridiculous. They'll face SMU in Charlotte in a de facto play-in game for the Tigers. SMU will probably be in, win or lose, but that's an all-or-nothing game for Clemson. On Saturday night in College Station, number 3 Texas defeated number 20 Texas A&M 17-7 in the renewal of the Lone Star Showdown. Like I said at the beginning of the episode with the Michigan-Ohio State final score, that 13-10 score in that game was pretty much indicative of how the game was played. This 17-7 score between Texas and Texas A&M is very deceptive. If you didn't watch the game, or maybe we're just keeping an eye on the score while doing other things, don't let that final score confuse you because Texas dominated this game. The Longhorns outgained Texas A&M in total yardage 461 to 248. That's a difference of 213 total yards. They had 26 first downs. The Aggies had 15. Texas controlled time of possession 35-25. And A&M was only in this game because of a 93-yard pick six on a deflected pass. And they also had the opportunity to make it interesting after a blocked punt, but Texas stuffed them at the goal line anyway. Texas's defense showed out yet again. They've been up near the top of the FBS in points per game allowed all year long, and that was evident in their performance in College Station. Texas A&M finishes the regular season 8-4 in Mike Elko's first year as head coach. Not how they wanted it to end, of course, with back-to-back losses, including one to their rival, but overall a pretty solid start to his tenure there. Steve Sarkisian and the Longhorns improved to 11-1. They've locked in a spot to the college football playoff, and now face Georgia for the SEC championship in their first season in the SEC. Number 18 Iowa State defeated number 24 Kansas State 29-21 on Saturday night in Ames, and for the first time in program history, the Iowa State Cyclones have won 10 games in a college football season. Coming into the year, there were just 3 Power 4 programs who had never had a 10-win season before. Both Indiana and Iowa State got their first 10-win season this year, leaving Vanderbilt as the only P4 school to never win 10 games in a season. With their win over the Wildcats, the Cyclones also stayed alive for the Big 12 championship game, which BYU's victory over Houston later that night eventually clinched for them. The Big 12 title game on Saturday will be Iowa State, Arizona State. I've mentioned it a few times on the show just about the chaos and unpredictability of this new Big 12, and that is as evident as ever with this Big 12 title game matchup, and that game should be a lot of fun. Number 9 SMU clobbered Cal 38-6 to cap off an 11-1 regular season. Cal was without starting quarterback Fernando Mendoza due to illness, but the Mustangs dominated from start to finish, with the win that complete an 8-0 season in conference play in their first ever season as a member of the ACC. There are 2 teams who went unbeaten in conference play in the Power 4 this year. One is SMU, and the other is number 1, Oregon. SMU will face Clemson on Saturday in the ACC Championship, but in my opinion, the Mustangs should be in the college football playoff regardless of the outcome of that game. They're 11-1, they're unbeaten in conference play like I mentioned. Their only loss is by 3 points to 10-2 BYU. They have 6 wins over bowl-eligible teams. They have a top 5 scoring offense, a top 20 scoring defense, and it just shouldn't even be a conversation in my opinion. They should be in. If teams like 10-2 Tennessee are considered in, and not even just in, they're likely to host a first-round game when they lost to 6-6 Arkansas and by 14 to Georgia, and have less wins over bowl-eligible teams than SMU does, then the Mustangs should be a complete and total lock. Elsewhere around the country, number 5 Notre Dame also clinched a spot in the playoff with a 49-35 road victory over USC. The Irish finished 11-1, and since that loss to Northern Illinois, they've had one of the most dominant finishes to the season of any team. Marcus Freeman and company have done a remarkable job to flush that loss, refocus, and regroup, and they've now won 10 consecutive games, and they'll probably finish number 5 or number 6 in the CFP committee's rankings, and they will host a CFP game. Another team in contention to host is Penn State. They absolutely stomped Maryland 44-7, and with Ohio State's loss to Michigan, the Nittany Lions punched their ticket to the Big Ten championship game with that victory over the Terrapins. Penn State will play Oregon, who dominated Washington 49-21 to cap off a 12-0 regular season, and the winner will get the first round bye. Then the loser, depending on the margin of loss, will probably be in that number 5 or number 6 seed, wherever they decide to put them in relation to Notre Dame. On Thanksgiving night, Memphis defeated number 17 Tulane 34-24, and the Tigers finished the regular season 10-2, with the potential to be ranked in tonight's CFP Top 25. The results of this game didn't alter anything in the AAC championship race. Tulane and Army had already clinched those spots the week before. Unfortunately for me, because I picked Memphis to win the AAC and be the Group of Five's representative in the college football playoff. The Tigers had a heartbreaking loss to Navy early in the season in a 56-44 shootout. That was 49-44 Navy, with Memphis driving all the way down to the midshipman 14-yard line before they threw an interception that was taken 86 yards the other way for a Navy touchdown to seal it. They also lost in a shootout to UTSA by 8, and in both those Navy and UTSA losses, they outgained their opponent by 100 yards in both games. They had 11 more first downs than Navy, they had 8 more first downs than UTSA, but just couldn't finish ahead on the scoreboard in either of them. So I came close with the prediction, but fell just short. Number 16 Arizona State destroyed Arizona 49-7, and this is one of the most dominant games of rivalry week. The score speaks for itself, but if you dive into some of the stats and specifically total yardage, the Sun Devils outgained the Wildcats 646-210. 646 yards to 210 yards. They had 436 more yards than Arizona did. And of course, Arizona is one of the least impressive teams in all the Power Four, but still, that type of destruction is impressive. As I mentioned earlier, Arizona State will play Iowa State in the Big 12 championship game, and the job that Kenny Dillingham and his staff have done there is truly incredible. Arizona State was 3-9 in the Pac-12 last season. They finished 2023 with one of the worst offenses in the country and one of the worst defenses in the country. They scored 18 points per game last year, 18, and allowed 32 points per game. That's an average of a 14-point loss. They beat their FCS opponent by 3 and lost to Fresno State 29-0 last year. They lost to their Group of 5 opponent 29-0. That was the only team that shut them out all year. They ended 2023 by losing to Oregon by 36 and to Arizona by 36 in back-to-back games. And in one calendar year, they've turned into a 10-2 team. They're Big 12 championship bound, and if they win one more game, they will be in the inaugural 12-team college football playoff field, and that's just absolutely remarkable. In one of the best finishes to a game in all of rivalry week, Duke beat Wake Forest 23-17 on a 39-yard touchdown pass from Malik Murphy to Jordan Moore as time expired in regulation. They were down 17-3 in that game and scored the final 20 points to win 23-17. The win over the Demon Deacons brings the Blue Devils to 9-3, where they finished with their best regular season record since 2013. And outside of that 2013 year, this is their first 9-win regular season since 1941, when they went to the Rose Bowl. And fun fact about that game, that's one of 2 times where the Rose Bowl wasn't played in Pasadena. One is 2020 when it was played in Texas due to COVID stuff. The other was 1941 when Duke hosted it. Duke hosted a Rose Bowl in Durham. So in Manny Diaz's first year as head coach and at the helm there, Duke has really had one of their better seasons in quite some time. And one of those 3 losses was in overtime to SMU after a blocked field goal in regulation as time expired. And this season is truly one of the best that Duke has ever had in the modern era. Florida dominated Florida State 31-11, and after a treacherous start to the season and ceaseless calls for him to be fired, Billy Napier has the Gators at 7-5, going to a bowl game, and things are looking up in Gainesville. The Gators have won 3 consecutive games, 2 of which coming over ranked opponents, and in games in which quarterback DJ Lagway started and finished without going out due to injury, the Gators improved to 5-0. 5-0 in games where Lagway started and didn't get hurt. 5-1 overall if you count the Georgia game where he went out in the second quarter. And a lot of that can also be attributed to the improvement that Florida made on the defensive side of the ball throughout the year. because to be completely honest, Lagway is really good, but the numbers he's put up haven't exactly been crazy. They had 17 points going into the fourth quarter on Saturday against FSU. But as a team and as a unit, the Gators have been very strong in the second half of the season. On the other side, one of the worst seasons in Florida State history has come to a merciful end for Seminoles fans. They finished 2-10. The 2024 season is their third worst that they've ever had in the 71-year history as a major program. 1-7 in ACC play is the worst season they've ever had in conference games. They finished 131st in points per game, 88th in points per game allowed. They averaged a 13-point loss on the season. On the bright side for them, though, that sounds a whole lot like what we were talking about before with Arizona State and how they were last season to what they are now. And we see the difference 1 year can make on that front. So Florida State also knows firsthand how quickly things can change, going from 13-0 to 2-10. And we'll see if they can go from as quickly as they did from good to bad, from potentially bad to good. I'm sure they'll be one of the biggest players in the portal this offseason, and we'll see if they hit on a bunch of recruits like they did before the 2023 season, or if they miss like they did last offseason. So they seem to want to live and die by the portal, and it'll be interesting to see which result they get leading up to 2025. In one of the more shocking outcomes of the week, Baylor absolutely destroyed Kansas 45-17. And after beating 3 consecutive ranked opponents, the Jayhawks just lay an absolute egg with bowl eligibility on the line in Waco. Baylor outgained Kansas 605 to 491. They put up over 600 yards and 32 first downs on this Jayhawks team that had been one of the hottest in the country coming into the week. The main reason I wanted to bring up this game is because Baylor finished the season 8-4. I'm not sure how many people knew that, but the Bears actually had a very underrated year, especially if you remember that one of those 4 losses came in overtime to Colorado after they gave up a Hail Mary as regulation expired. So they are 1 incomplete pass at the end of that game away from being 9-3, and I'm not sure what their tiebreaker situation was in the Big 12 standings, but they would have been right in that group of contenders for the Big 12 title and a potential CFP spot. Dave Aranda and the Bears had a very quiet season in Waco, but an impressive one that could end in 9 wins if they beat their bowl game opponent. And lastly, Minnesota beat Wisconsin 24-7, and this one was a lot more important than it might look because this loss dropped the Badgers to 5-7. This is the first season where Wisconsin is not going to a bowl game and will not finish with a winning record for the first time in 22 years. The last time they weren't bowl eligible and didn't finish with a winning record was 2001, when they also went 5-7, so one of the more impressive active streaks of consistency has been snapped. Alright, now it's time for Kings of the Week, a segment where I highlight some of the best performances across the country each and every week. First up, we have Georgia Tech quarterback Haynes King. This one is an all-timer, fitting that it came in the final week of the regular season, but on the road at number 7 Georgia on Friday night, King went 26 of 36 passing, that's 72%, for 303 yards and 2 touchdowns. That alone is pretty solid, but then he also led the team in rushing with 24 carries for 110 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. 26 completions, 24 carries, 413 total yards, 5 total touchdowns. Absolutely insane. With that performance, he became the first player in FBS history with 300-plus passing yards, 100-plus rushing yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns against an AP Top 10 team. Then we have South Carolina quarterback Lenora Sellers, who is a beast, primarily on the ground, but not terrible through the air either. Against number 12 Clemson, he had 164 passing yards and then 16 carries for 166 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, including the game-winning 20-yard touchdown run late in the fourth quarter. One thing you won't see in the box score as part of his performance was the fact that he broke 18 tackles in this game. 18 different broken tackles. He was a problem all afternoon for Clemson's defense. Next, we have Syracuse defensive back Devin Grant against the number 1 offense in college football, that of Cam Ward and the Miami Hurricanes. Grant had 5 total tackles, 3 solo tackles, a forced fumble, a fumble recovery, and a scoop and score touchdown. He had one of the biggest plays of the game, and that play helped Syracuse earn one of their biggest wins in quite some time. And lastly, we have the entire Iowa State University. The Cyclones earned their first ever 10-win season, and they had a really rough history in the football department for a long time, but head coach Matt Campbell finally got this program to a 10-win season. They were 7-0, suffered back-to-back losses to fall to 7-2, and everyone was like, oh boy, here we go again, another almost 10-win season, but they're not going to reach it. But the Cyclones regrouped. They beat Cincinnati by 17. They beat Utah by 3. and then defeated rival number 24 Kansas State 29-21. They have 10 wins, they're going to the Big 12 championship game, and they are 1 win away from the college football playoff. That's going to wrap up this episode of the CFB Kings Show, the last one of the regular season. We'll have the Thursday episode previewing championship weekend, so make sure to come back for that. But the regular season is finished, one of the best that we've had in a long time, and I can't wait to see what the postseason has in store. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, follow if you're listening on Spotify, and definitely go check out @CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching, have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.